They say control is the only currency that matters in the shadows. Fear, loyalty, silence. Kim Park owned them all. What he didn't have was a reason to believe the world deserved anything more than ashes. For 12 years, his soul had been hardening, turning into the very stone he used to build his empire. 12 years of burying friends, of erasing enemies, of feeling the cold weight of nihilism press down on him every time he looked at the city he helped corrupt. 12 years of wondering if the blood on his hands had finally stained him so deep that he was no longer human. He ruled the Korean Mafia's operations in downtown LA with a scorched-earth policy. But in the quiet hours of the night, he was empty. The strategy didn't fill the void. The money didn't drown out the silence. The rage became a second skin, invisible to his lieutenants, but suffocating to him alone. He started to believe this was his destiny, to be the match that would eventually set the whole world on fire. Then he kicked in the door of a ruined laundromat on a smoggy Thursday. Sophia Carey, a 7-year-old girl who looked at him with large, expressive eyes that held no fear, only a quiet awareness that stopped his heart cold. She didn't know about the dragon of downtown. She didn't know that the man in the tailored suit was moments away from ordering the destruction of her entire neighborhood. She didn't know that every word she spoke, every innocent question she asked, was a crack in the armor he'd spent a decade welding shut. She didn't know that for the first time in 12 years, his hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the sudden, terrifying weight of a conscience he thought he'd killed. And she definitely didn't know that her presence would put her in the crosshairs of a war he had already started. This is a story about a man who was ready to burn everything down, and a girl who gave him a reason to stop. About a protection that goes deeper than bodyguards, about the kind of innocence that doesn't just change your mind, but forces you to rebuild your soul. And about how sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in a world built on fire is try to keep one small light from going out. Kim Park was not a man who showed mercy. In the years since he rose to power, he had perfected the art of the kill, the careful, cold calculation of total elimination. But as he looked at the small girl with the beaded braids offering him a piece of candy, the dragon realized he was no longer in control. The air inside the Vernon Avenue laundromat was thick with the scent of cheap detergent and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Outside, the city was already beginning to scream, but inside, Kim Park stood in a pocket of unnatural silence. His men had moved through the building like a scythe, a whirlwind of black suits and suppressed gunfire, clearing out the street-level dealers who had dared to siphon off his mentor's territory. Kim stood in the center of the wreckage, his tailored suit a sharp, dark contrast to the cracked linoleum floor. He adjusted his cufflinks, his face a mask of granite, while his lieutenant, Jiro, stepped over a fallen chair. "The back is clear, boss," Jiro reported, his voice devoid of empathy. "The target fled, but he left his ledger. We have enough to start the sweep. Should we burn it now?" Kim reached into his pocket for his lighter, the silver casing cool against his palm. He looked at the rows of washing machines, their glass eyes staring back at him like witnesses. He was ready to give the order, the one that would turn this block into a warning sign for the rest of LA. Then he heard it, a soft, rhythmic clicking sound. It wasn't the sound of a gun being cocked, it was the sound of plastic beads hitting one another. Kim's eyes narrowed. He followed the sound to the far end of the service counter, where a piece of loose plywood hung by a single nail. He gestured for Jiro to stay back. With a slow, deliberate movement, Kim hooked his shoe under the plywood and kicked it aside. He expected a frantic runner or a desperate gunman. He didn't expect Sophia. She was tucked into the narrow space between the industrial dryers. Her braided hair was adorned with small, colorful beads that caught the dim fluorescent light. In her lap sat a tattered book, and in her hand was a single strawberry hard candy. Kim froze. His hand, which had been reaching for the lighter to ignite a war, stalled in mid-air. For the first time in 12 years, the dragon found himself staring into eyes that didn't reflect terror. Sophia didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She simply looked at him with a quiet, grounded sincerity that felt like a physical blow to his chest. "Are you the one in charge?" she asked. Her voice was small but steady, carrying a weight of maturity that shouldn't belong to a 7-year-old. Kim didn't answer. He couldn't. "My grandma went to get help when the loud noises started," she continued, holding out the strawberry candy toward his blood-stained cuff. "She said if I stayed real still, the monsters would pass by. You look like you're having a bad day, mister. Do you want my candy?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Jiro stepped forward, his hand moving toward his holster. "Boss, we're losing time. The perimeter is failing." Kim looked at the candy, then at the girl who saw a mister where the world saw a monster. The lighter in his pocket felt suddenly, inexplicably heavy. He realized then that if he burned this building, he wasn't just killing a rival's business. He was erasing the only creature in Los Angeles who wasn't afraid of him. "Change of plans," Kim said, his voice a low rasp. He didn't look at Jiro. He reached down, his large, scarred hand hovering for a second before he gently took the candy. "We're not burning it. Not tonight." The black Mercedes-Benz glided through the rain-slicked streets of the industrial district, a silent predator in a city that was beginning to bleed. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was stifling. Kim Park sat in the back, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the window. Beside him, Sophia was buckled into the leather seat, her small hands resting on the tattered book she refused to leave behind. She was humming a low, tuneless melody that seemed to grate against the jagged nerves of the men in the front. "The Highland Park house is ready, boss," Jiro said, his voice coming through the partition like a serrated blade. He didn't look back through the rearview mirror. "But it's a detour. Wan Kyung's people are mobilizing at the docks. Every minute we spend playing babysitter is a minute they use to dig in." Kim didn't blink. "She stays at the safe house until the grandmother is located. That is the order." Jiro's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. "With all due respect, the men are asking questions. We came to burn Vernon to the ground. Instead, we're retreating with a witness. It looks like hesitation, Kim. And in this city, hesitation is a terminal illness." Kim turned his head slowly. The dragon was back in his eyes, cold and predatory. "Are you questioning me, Jiro?" The car fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Even Sophia stopped humming, her large eyes darting between the back of Jiro's head and Kim's stone-carved profile. She seemed to sense the shift in the air, the way the loyalty in the car had suddenly curdled into something sour and dangerous. When they arrived at the Highland Park Villa, a secluded property hidden behind high concrete walls and weeping willows, the tension reached a breaking point. 2 of Kim's soldiers stood at the gate, their expressions unreadable, but their eyes lingered too long on the girl in the back seat. They didn't bow as deeply as they had yesterday. As Kim stepped out, sheltering Sophia with the vent of his suit jacket to keep the drizzle off her braids, he caught Jiro sharing a lingering, silent look with the guards. It was a look of shared frustration, a seed of mutiny beginning to sprout in the dark. "Check the perimeter," Kim commanded, his voice a low growl. "Already done, boss. But you should know, word travels fast. The streets think the dragon has grown soft. If we hide here, we're just making it easier for Wan Kyung to find us." Kim looked down at Sophia, who was staring up at the dark, imposing house with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He realized then that the safe house wasn't safe at all. The threat wasn't just the rival bosses or the fires in the streets. It was the men standing 5 feet away from him. His own shadow was starting to sharpen its teeth. He wasn't just protecting a girl from a war. He was now protecting her from his own empire. The heavy silence of the Highland Park Villa was broken only by the low hum of the industrial refrigerator in the kitchen. Kim Park sat at the marble island, his suit jacket discarded for the first time in memory, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and old, jagged scars. He wasn't looking at the city maps spread out before him. He was watching Sophia. She had found a stool and was carefully arranging a set of mismatched magnets on the fridge door. The tension from the car seemed to have rolled off her like rain, replaced by a quiet, focused domesticity that felt alien in a house built for war. "My grandma says that when people are quiet like you, it's because their hearts are full of unsaid words," Sophia said, not looking back. She stepped down and walked over to the island, placing a small, crumpled drawing she had carried in her book onto the marble. It was a crude but vibrant sketch of two figures holding hands under a yellow sun. "That's us. Well, it was supposed to be me and her, but you can be the tall one today." Kim looked at the drawing, then at the girl. "You should be eating, not drawing," he said, his voice lacking its usual bite. "There is food in the pantry." "I'm not hungry for food," she replied, climbing onto the stool beside him. "I'm hungry for home." She leaned her chin on her hand, her beaded braids clicking softly. "Grandma says we're survivors. That's why we moved to the city. She said if we could survive the South, we could survive anything. But she never mentioned men with fire and loud noises." Kim felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest, a phantom limb of a conscience he thought he'd successfully amputated years ago. He looked at his hands, the hands that had authorized the burn order, and then at the innocents sitting mere inches away. "The world is a violent place, Sophia," Kim said quietly, his gaze fixed on the drawing. "I am a part of that violence." "You took the candy," she countered simply. "Monsters don't take strawberry candy, they just eat the person." She reached out, her small, warm fingers brushing against the cold metal of his expensive wristwatch. "You have a lot of clocks, Mr. Kim. Are you waiting for something to happen?" Kim looked into her expressive eyes and saw no judgment, only a terrifyingly pure curiosity. For a moment, the dragon vanished. He wasn't the boss of a criminal empire or a man seeking a scorched-earth vendetta. He was just a man who had forgotten the sound of a voice that didn't want something from him. "I was waiting for the world to end," Kim admitted, the words tasting like ash. Sophia shook her head, the beads in her hair catching the kitchen light. "The world isn't ending, it's just dark. You just need someone to hold the light for you until your eyes adjust." She pushed the drawing toward him. As Kim's fingers touched the paper, the armor he had worn for 12 years didn't just crack, it began to crumble. For the first time, he didn't see the city as a map to be conquered, but as a place where grandmothers were missing and little girls were waiting for the monsters to turn back into men. The fragile piece of the kitchen was shattered by the vibrating buzz of a burner phone against the marble countertop. Kim's hand, which had been resting near Sophia's drawing, snapped back into its role as a weapon. He answered without a word, his face reverting to the cold, impenetrable mask of the dragon. On the other end, Menacio's voice was frantic, underscored by the distant sound of heavy machinery and lapping water. "Boss, we've been played. The fires in Vernon, they weren't just a provocation, they were a smokescreen." Kim stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. Sophia flinched at the sound, her beads clicking as she pulled her tattered book to her chest. Kim didn't look at her. He couldn't afford to. "Explain," he commanded. "While we were focused on the laundromat and the street war, Huang Qiang moved his heavy hitters to the port of Long Beach," Menacio reported. "They're not just moving pills anymore. He seized the primary shipping terminal. He's clearing out our containers and replacing them with his own. If he secures the docks, he doesn't just control the street, he controls the gateway to the city. We'll be choked out by morning." Kim's jaw tightened. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Huang Qiang hadn't been hiding, he had been distracting. He had counted on Kim's rage, and perhaps his sudden, inexplicable detour with a child, to leave the city's most vital artery unguarded. "Jiro is already there," Menacio added, though his voice held a note of hesitation. "He took a strike team without waiting for your word. He said you were occupied."
The air in the villa grew cold. Kim looked at Sophia, who was watching him with a wide, intuitive gaze. She didn't understand the logistics of a dockside coup, but she understood the shift in his energy. The monster was back, and it was hungry. "Gather the remaining units," Kim said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "We're going to the port." "And the girl?" Menasio asked. Kim glanced at the drawing on the counter. The yellow sun and the two figures looked like a cruel joke in the face of the escalating war. Huang Qiang was no longer just a rival. He was a shadow that threatened to eclipse everything Kim had just begun to remember about being human. If the docks fell, the city would become a graveyard, and there would be no safe house left for a girl with beads in her hair. "She comes with me," Kim said, the decision tasting like iron. "Tell Jiro to hold his position. If he moves before I arrive, I'll consider it an act of treason." He hung up and turned to Sophia. He reached out, his large hand pausing before gently closing her book for her. "The quiet time is over, Sophia. We have to go." Sophia stood up, her expression brave despite the tremor in her hands. "Is the shadow coming back?" "The shadow never left," Kim replied, his eyes dark with the coming storm. "But I'm going to make sure it doesn't touch you."
The drive toward the port was a gauntlet of rain and neon, but inside the SUV, the air was thick with the scent of copper. A stray bullet from a motorcycle drive-by, a desperate play by one of Huang Qiang's scouts, had shattered the rear window and grazed Kim's upper arm. He sat in the shadows of the back seat, jaw clenched, his white dress shirt blooming with a jagged crimson stain. Kim reached for the first aid kit under the seat, but his fingers were clumsy with adrenaline. Before he could protest, Sophia moved. She didn't ask for permission. She simply knelt on the floor mat, her beaded braids clicking against the leather as she opened the plastic case. "My grandma is a nurse," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the chaotic swaying of the car. "I help her all the time when the neighbors get hurt." Kim started to pull away, his instinctual need for distance flaring up. "Sophia, sit back. It's just a scratch." "It's not a scratch if it doesn't stop leaking," she countered, her large eyes fixed on the wound with a clinical, quiet focus. She pulled out an antiseptic wipe and a roll of gauze. As she pressed the cool cloth to his skin, Kim hissed, his muscles tensing into iron. "Soft breaths, Mr. Kim," she murmured, echoing a comfort she had likely received 1,000 times. As her small, warm fingers worked to bandage the gash, Kim looked down at her. In the strobe light flashes of passing street lamps, he saw the vulnerability of her neck, the fragility of her small frame against the heavy ballistic door of the vehicle. For years, Kim had stepped into gunfights with a nihilistic shrug, viewing his own life as a spent shell casing. He had never feared the blade or the bullet because he had nothing to lose. But now, watching Sophia meticulously tuck the end of the gauze, a cold, visceral terror gripped him, a feeling far more paralyzing than the threat of Huang Qiang's army. He realized that a stray round had traveled 3 inches to the left. Those braids would be soaked in red. The thought made his lungs seize. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of dying. He was terrified of surviving in a world where she was gone. "There," she said, patting the bandage gently. She looked up, offering a small, tired smile. "All fixed." Kim didn't thank her. He couldn't find the breath. Instead, he reached out with his uninjured arm and pulled the heavy tactical vest from the floorboard, draped it over her small shoulders like a shield, and tucked her firmly into the corner of the seat, furthest from the glass. "Stay there," he rasped, his hand lingering for a second on her shoulder. "Don't move, no matter what you hear." He turned back to the window, his eyes turning into flint. The dragon was no longer fighting for territory or Mentor's pride. He was fighting to keep the only light he had left from being extinguished in the dark. The sky over the port of Long Beach was the color of a fresh bruise, deep purples and jagged oranges bleeding into the Pacific as the sun dipped below the horizon. Kim stood by the edge of the shipping terminal, the wind whipping his tie against his chest, while Sophia sat huddled in the back seat of the SUV, a silent sentinel behind reinforced glass. Jiro approached from the shadows of a towering crane, his phone already tucked away in his pocket. His face was a mask of cold efficiency, but his eyes were restlessly tracking the movement of the guards Kim had placed around the perimeter. "The strike team is in position, boss," Jiro said, his voice flat. "Wang Qiang is moving his main shipment into Terminal 4. If we hit them now, we take his legs out from under him." Kim didn't look at his lieutenant. He was watching the way the shadows stretched across the asphalt, sensing a rhythm that was offbeat. "The scouts said Wang Qiang was reinforced," Kim murmured, his hand resting instinctively on the door handle of the SUV. "This is too exposed. He's not a man who leaves his flank open." "He's desperate," Jiro countered, stepping closer. "He thinks you're compromised because of the girl. He's sloppy." But the sloppiness wasn't Wang Qiang's. Kim noticed the way the 3 men Jiro had brought with him weren't watching the harbor. They were watching Kim's back. He realized then that the dragon had stayed in the cave too long. Jiro hadn't just been questioning Kim's resolve, he had been calculating the cost of it. To Jiro, a boss with a heart was a boss with a target on his head, and it was better to be the one holding the bow than the one standing in the way of the arrow. "I sent the coordinates to the backup units," Jiro added, a faint, sharp smile touching his lips. Kim felt the air turn to ice. He knew Jiro's backup wouldn't be wearing the Park family crest. Jiro had leaked the location to Wang Qiang, inviting the rival to do the dirty work of clearing the throne. By the time the night was over, Jiro intended to be the only man left standing in the ruins of 2 empires. The sound of a heavy engine roared in the distance, not a cargo truck, but the aggressive whine of a modified tactical vehicle. From the northern gate, headlights cut through the gloom like twin, predatory eyes. "You should have burned that laundromat, Kim," Jiro whispered, stepping back toward the cover of the shipping containers as the first crack of a sniper's rifle echoed across the water. "Now you're going to burn with it." Kim didn't waste a second on a rebuttal. He dived for the driver's seat of the SUV. His only thought was the small girl with the beaded braids. The betrayal stung, but the fear for Sophia was a roar that drowned out the world. The trap had sprung, and the city was no longer just at war, it was hunting them. The port of Long Beach became a hellscape of strobing muzzle flashes and twisted metal. The initial explosion from a redirected fuel tanker sent a wall of orange flame rolling toward the terminal office, turning the night into an artificial, sweltering day. Kim Park didn't wait for the heat to subside. He slammed his SUV into reverse, tires screaming against the asphalt. But as he reached for the back door to pull Sophia into the front seat, his heart stopped. The door was hanging open, swaying like a broken wing. The seat was empty. Through the shimmering veil of heat and black smoke, Kim saw the retreating silhouette of Jiro. His former lieutenant had the small girl tucked under one arm like a piece of salvaged cargo, disappearing into the skeletal remains of an old fish processing warehouse that was already beginning to roar with fire. Jiro wasn't just escaping, he was taking the only thing that could force Kim to walk into a death trap. Kim sprinted toward the burning structure, ignoring the bullets that pinged off the shipping containers around him. He didn't signal his men, he didn't call for cover. The dragon was gone, replaced by a man possessed by a single, desperate clarity. Inside the warehouse, the air was a toxic soup of ash and burning oil. The sound was deafening, the groan of warping steel beams and the hungry crackle of timber.
Kim moved through the maze of fire, his expensive suit jacket catching on jagged metal, his lungs burning with every breath. He didn't look for Hwan Kyung's men, even as they stepped out from behind the flames. He dispatched them with a cold, mechanical brutality, his movements fueled by a terrifying focus. He wasn't there to win a war. He was there to save a soul. "Sophia!" he roared, his voice cracking against the heat. From the upper catwalk, a small, high-pitched scream pierced through the roar of the fire. "Mr. Kim!" He looked up. Jiro stood on a narrow metal walkway, the flames licking at the floorboards beneath him. He held Sophia over the railing, her beaded braids swinging in the updraft of the fire. Jiro's face was distorted by a mixture of triumph and madness. "Look at you," Jiro yelled over the inferno. "The great Kim Park crawling through the ashes for a stray. You've lost everything for her." Kim stopped at the base of the stairs, the fire reflecting in his eyes like twin suns. He didn't look at Jiro's gun. He only looked at Sophia's terrified face. She was crying, but when her eyes met his, she reached out a small, trembling hand. "I don't care about the city," Kim said, his voice low and vibrating with a lethal promise that cut through the noise of the collapsing building. "I don't care about the throne. Put her down, Jiro, and I will let you run. Keep her, and I will show you why they call me the dragon." The ceiling groaned, a massive support beam beginning to buckle directly above them. The choice was no longer about power, it was about who would survive the fire.
The groan of the buckling support beam was a countdown to a funeral. Jiro stood on the trembling catwalk, his eyes darting between the encroaching fire and the man he once called a leader. Below them, the warehouse floor was a sea of embers, and emerging from the smoke on the far side was Hwan Kyung. The rival boss moved with a slow, predatory confidence, flanked by two gunmen who kept their weapons trained on Kim's chest. "A king who bows to a child is a king who has already abdicated." Hwan Kyung's voice cut through the roar of the flames, cold and mocking. "Look at you, Kim. You're covered in soot, bleeding for a girl who isn't even your own. Jiro was right. You've become a liability to this city." Kim didn't look at Hwan Kyung. He didn't even look at the barrels of the guns pointed at his heart. His eyes were locked on Sophia. She was trembling, her small hands white-knuckled as they gripped the railing, but she didn't look away from him. She was waiting for the man she saw in the kitchen, the one who took the strawberry candy. "Jiro," Kim said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency that seemed to vibrate beneath the sound of the fire, cold and mocking. "The beam above you is going to snap in less than 60 seconds. If you drop her, you die with her. If you give her to me, you might make it to the stairs before the roof comes down." "He's lying," Hwan Kyung shouted, gesturing to his gunman. "Finish him!" But Kim did something neither of them expected. He reached slowly into his waistband and pulled out his firearm, not to aim it, but to toss it into the fire below. The metal clattered against the concrete and vanished into the orange glow. He stood before them unarmed, his hands open, his dragon persona discarded like a shed skin. "I'm not a boss tonight," Kim said, stepping forward into the heat. "I'm just a man who was going to get that girl out of here. If you want the city, Hwan Kyung, take it. If you want the throne, Jiro, it's yours. Just let her go." The tactical shock of Kim's surrender created a momentary vacuum of indecision. In that heartbeat of hesitation, the support beam above the catwalk gave a final, agonizing crack. Jiro's face paled as the metal groaned. Panic finally overrode his ambition. He shoved Sophia toward the stairs and turned to run toward the far exit. Kim didn't wait.
As Hwan Kyung's men fumbled to react to the shifting structure, Kim lunged. He didn't go for the enemies, he leaped for the stairs, catching Sophia just as the walkway began to tilt. He shielded her body with his own as a shower of sparks and molten lead rained down. With a strength born of pure desperation, he swung her over a collapsing gap and rolled onto the lower landing. Behind them, the catwalk plummeted, taking the path to the rivals with it. The ceiling began to cave in, separating Kim and Sophia from the men who sought their lives. As the wall of debris fell, Kim saw Hwan Kyung and Jiro's faces one last time, shadows of men consumed by the very fire they had started. Kim didn't look back. He stood up, cradled Sophia against his chest, and ran toward the sliver of moonlight visible through the smoke. He had lost his empire, but as he felt the girl's steady heartbeat against his own, he knew he had won the only war that mattered.
The dawn broke over Los Angeles, not with a roar, but with a weary, gray stillness. The smoke from the harbor had thinned into a hazy veil that hung over the skyline, smelling of salt and extinguished ambitions. In the master suite of the Highland Park villa, Kim Park stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, the same vantage point where 48 hours ago he had been prepared to watch the world burn. His reflection in the glass was nearly unrecognizable. The sharp, predatory lines of his face were softened by exhaustion, and the pristine black suit he usually wore as armor had been replaced by a simple, dark sweater. He didn't look like a dragon. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck. In his hand, he wasn't clicking a silver lighter. He wasn't obsessing over the flicker of a flame or the scent of butane. Instead, his thumb traced the smooth wooden surface of a single pink bead attached to a frayed elastic hair tie. He had found it on the floor of the SUV after the paramedics had taken Sophia and her grandmother, found safe in a shelter, to the hospital for observation. The power he had spent a lifetime accumulating felt like ash in his mouth. Wang Kyung was gone, his empire dismantled by the very chaos he had tried to weaponize. Jiro was a ghost, fled into the shadows of the underworld he had tried to steal. The throne of the city was empty, waiting for a monster to claim it. But Kim Park was finished with monsters. A light knock at the door broke his reverie. It was Mnesio, looking battered but steady. "The captains are waiting downstairs, Kim," his loyal friend said softly. "They want to know the plan for the reconstruction. They want to know how we're going to retake the territory Wang Kyung left behind." Kim looked at the beaded tie one last time before slipping it into his pocket, keeping it close to his heart. He turned away from the window, away from the view of a city he used to want to conquer. "Tell them the reconstruction starts today," Kim said, his voice resonant and clear, stripped of its former nihilism. "But we aren't building a fortress, we're building a neighborhood. We're going to fund the clinics, the schools, and the laundromats. We're going to protect the streets, not bleed them." Mnesio stared at him, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face. "That's a lot of work for a mafia boss." "I'm not a boss," Kim replied, walking toward the door with a new sense of purpose. "I'm someone who has a reason to make sure this city is still standing 10 years from now." He thought of Sophia's drawing, the yellow sun and the two figures holding hands. As he stepped out of the room to face his men, Kim Park realized that the most powerful thing a man could do wasn't to start a fire, but to keep a single light burning in the dark.